Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with a closer look at the extreme weather around the world. Torrential rains and floods hit Western Europe, leaving more than 200 people dead in Germany, Belgium and Austria. Mudslides rampaged through houses, roads and railways. In North America, wildfires are devastating parts of the western U.S. and Canada. Thick fire smoke covered skylines and made air filthy, reaching as far as Europe. Meanwhile, central China's Henan province has once raised the highest emergency alert after record rainstorms and rising waters have battered the region, killing dozens and affecting 3 million people. For more on the apparent extreme weather, we are joined in Washington, D.C. Wu Changhua, Executive Director and Professional Association for China's Environment. In London via Skype, Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. It is a website working on the issue of China's environment. Welcome to both of you. Of course, this is not limited to China. Many ask what's going on with climate change, and is it what we are having right now a result of that? Ms. Hilton.
Well, the science of attribution has got much better than it was, and there is absolutely no doubt, if you look at the trends, that we are suffering from far more intense weather, more frequent natural disasters because of climate change. In the last decade, there were 7,348 extreme natural disasters, according to the United Nations. That's double the number in the previous decade. So the trend is absolutely unequivocal. And it's a bit, you have to think of it a bit like epidemiology. You can't say that if I smoke, your cigarettes cause my cancer. And it's difficult to say that one particular event is attributable to climate change. But if you treat it as a broader evidential model, there's no doubt.
If you look at the life of Earth, it's been with us for a very long time. So what does it mean? I mean, a few decades of extreme weather or a few years of extreme weather in the overall circumstances that the Earth has been experiencing over its lifetime. Ms. Wu, how should we look at that?
Well, the scientists are telling us the Earth definitely is becoming warming, and even more so, it's accelerated the warming trend. So we are pretty much stuck in the current situation. So when the temperature keeps warming up, the air holds more water vapors, and in the meantime, actually, the warming also affects the weakening. Actually, the jet stream, the air current circulation around the Earth. So all this phenomena is actually caused mostly by climate change warming at this moment, somehow coming together and triggering cascading climate extreme weather events. That is why we are living in it. And from North America, Europe and China today, I think facts after facts, it proves that we are not prepared to live through it or live with it. In the meantime, actually, from action perspective, we seem not to be prepared to slow down climate change, mitigating climate change at the speed that's required.
So far, we are already seeing commitment made by the Paris Agreement. Meanwhile, we also see the carbon cuts about the peak and neutrality committed by countries and economies. Of course, there is a process in which they have to realize those goals. But what does that mean from now until then, 50, 60? Meanwhile, will that goal being met and then things are getting better? So as environmentalists, but also, I guess, need to be scientists, what is your take on all of this immediate goals and the overall trend that we are likely to face?
I think that the long-term goals are very important because they give you a benchmark. The commitments that were on the table in the Paris Agreement take us to about 3.5 degrees of warming. We're currently at just over 1 degree of warming, and our best hope is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So we have very little time. So the importance of the long-term targets, which are essentially carbon neutrality by mid-century, is that they give us something to work back from. But the urgency, the deceptive thing about a long-term target is that it might lead you to think you have that much time, and we don't. The reason 2030 is a very important goal is that after 2030, it becomes much harder if we haven't made really serious, substantial progress by then. So, every day of delay, every week of delay makes it harder. And we've been delaying for 20, 30 years. We really haven't moved substantially. In December, we have another conference of the parties to the Paris Agreement, at which we are all meant to ramp up our commitments, because that was the arrangement at Paris, that we'd come back every 5 years and we would tighten the commitment so that we kept on that 1.5 degree pathway. We're not there yet. We need to move much faster, and this is a real warning. If we don't, the other big danger is that we might nudge natural systems over a tipping point. So one example might be melting permafrost and methane release, which would be catastrophic.
Mitigation is one thing, adaptation is another. In face of natural disaster, adaptation probably is even more important right now. So how do we make sure things are happening all at the same time, not just focus on one thing while ignoring the other thing? And meanwhile, by the way, where's this international cooperation, even on adaptation? I haven't seen much at all. What's going on, Ms. Wu?
Well, I think for a long time in the international governance mechanism, if you look at the Paris Agreement, the language is there. We've been keep repeating the messages that mitigation, adaptation should go hand in hand. That's everywhere. That's a common message embedded at a national level, at a global level there as well. But in reality, adaptation actions and investments lags far behind mitigation. Partly because I think, yes, the level of understanding of the impacts probably is not there. And the other side, actually, mitigation, we have something more specific, carbon emissions, to work around. But adaptation is much more sophisticated or complicated in a way. It covers everything from infrastructure to agriculture, from emergency response and early warning. So it's ubiquitous. So humanity somehow at this moment has not learned quickly or enough to handle the adaptation challenge.
There are a lot of rhetoric going on, politics going on as well, but when it comes to real concrete solutions, even just to save one life, it's extremely crucial than all the rhetoric itself. So, Ms. Hilton, as environmentalists yourself and your colleagues, how has the question of adaptation been analyzed? What are some of the most important adaptations that we should do now, given that we are facing a worldwide natural disaster intensive period?
It's absolutely, it's an enormous challenge. As Wu Changhua says, it covers so many aspects. But, I think some of the lessons of the events of this year have taught us what a huge challenge adaptation would be. And there will be things we can't adapt to. There will be parts of the world that we need to abandon because we can't adapt either to extreme
What do you mean by that?
Sea level rise. I'm sorry?
What do you mean by that?
Well, human beings live near water. We build our cities on the banks of rivers. We've seen what happened in Zhengzhou, which is actually a progressive city in terms of trying to build infrastructure that absorbs water. But its subway system is 5 years old, and it's clearly not proof against these extreme floods. But if you multiply that over every city in the world, just imagine what we're facing. There are nearly 100,000 dams in China, most of them built 50 years ago. To make those proof against the kind of stresses that we're now facing would be enormously expensive. We have built our infrastructure to stress levels that were normal 30 years ago, in which you build to withstand a 1 in 100 year event. The problem is that those 1 in 100-year events are now more extreme and they come more frequently. So all of our infrastructure is inadequate to the task. We have to stop and rebuild. People will have to move. We will have to make massive adjustments to the way we produce food, to the way we get around, just because our infrastructure isn't going to sustain the habits of the past.
It's very
Here in the
interesting,
UK, we have
Isabel,
railway
that you
lines
use
along
the
the coast
example
going into the sea.
of Zhengzhou, because Zhengzhou is relatively a newly built city, one could argue. It is not a traditional industrial city. It is only with recent years of development, and it has pretty good infrastructure. If you compare that to some of the biggest cities even around the world, the US, for example, its infrastructure probably is also going through the test, both in California, in New York, and some of the other places. So, but then the question has to be pragmatic. I mean, how much can you put into infrastructure rebuilding to save the world from once in 200 years a disaster? How much would that mean? But particularly given the time it is a pandemic. Sometimes the answer has to be comprehensive rather than focusing on one point. I know that's the difficult part, but comprehensive thinking is very important. Ms. Wu, also I want to invite your advice on this as well.
Sure, I think we are now talking about Zhengzhou. And if you look at the action perspective, Zhengzhou is one of the role model cities in China that has started to build something called the sponge city. And the concept, the core part of the sponge city is to take into consideration, the nature's role as well as actually wetlands. And so taking into consideration the function provided more by nature to help with the resilience or adaptation at this moment. But the design at this moment is pretty much looking into a couple of things. One, the past, right, the history. So the data, the modeling is based on data of the past, the history, but somehow today we know we have to look into the future. So that's not adequately integrated. The other thing actually is the details, right, and say whether that's adequate and how much money to invest now. I think that's always, the cost is always an issue on the table, practical issues there. So again, back to the point you mentioned, I think is, Zhengzhou definitely has been championing solutions, but how somehow in the current situation is not adequate. I want to add one point to the international cooperation. I think with the technology development, the particular space technology, satellite, so the global has the capability actually to do this early warning, to do the early warning as soon as possible, as early as possible, so that people being alert and so that they have more time to take actions. Of course, early warning won't be adequate because actions are going to be demanded actually in reality, so that we're going to have enough actions to relieve, rescue, and repair.
Ms. Hilton, we've been talking about climate change for a long time. You and I, Ms. Wu as well, and many of your peers. But we see politics has been the fundamental blockade against the human being to focus on one common issue, that is the climate change. And we don't see that change. Rather, we see it intensified under the current geopolitical atmosphere. So, Ms. Hilton, you and your colleagues have been raising your voice as much as you can with your capability. But realistically speaking, when it comes to individuals, like everyone that's watching our program right now, what can they do when politics don't help?
I'm worried about the politics, and you're absolutely right to raise it. What I would say about the politics, though, and to everyone who is concerned about this issue, is that, the climate doesn't care about politics. The climate isn't going to stop because we can't sort our politics out. So that if we do it collectively, which I would prefer, or if we do it individually, we have to do it, because the consequences of not doing it are terrible. We don't have that luxury. Every individual can reduce his or her carbon footprint. Every individual can try to impress upon his or her leaders that this is something that they care about deeply, that they care for the future of their children, that they care for their neighbors and their friends. We can put pressure on our leaders. We can try to raise the discussion beyond finger pointing and beyond mutual accusation, which really get us nowhere. You know, we set up China Dialogue in order to get past that, and it is disappointing to see a return of negative rhetoric. But I think that at the same time, there's also a much more profound understanding of the inescapability of the need for action on this issue.
Ms. Wu, same question.
Well, there are definitely a lot of things actually individuals can do. I think there are studies already around the world. I think one particular study mentioned 80 things individuals can do in their daily lives and also actually in their work. And many of them actually mentioned by Isabel already. So basically, I think the consumers, individuals need to play their power, particularly their purchasing power. For instance, next vehicles you're going to buy, you shouldn't really buy ICE, you should buy EV, right? And so they're going to be sort of products, services, and also infrastructures invested by government, private sector together. But consumers need to adopt them as soon as possible. So that there are many things that could do. In the meantime, they do need to demand collectively for much accelerated solutions actually from policymakers and politicians around the world.
I'm also thinking about how they can protect themselves, you know, when the natural disaster comes. Who knows, right? For now, thank you so much, Wu Changhua, Isabel Hilton.
Well,
really
I think
appreciate it.
Yeah, no,
thank
they
you.
could do.
We're running out of time, but really appreciate your advice and insights.